Hello, I'm Tanweer Ali from the Faculty of Business Administration at the Prague University of Economics and Business. My research interests revolve around institutions and institutional economics. I'm joined today by my colleague Andrea Saenz de Viteri, also an institutional economist at our university, and her work focuses in particular on Latin America. Our guest today is Geoffrey Hodgson, Emeritus Professor at Loughborough University in Britain, and one of the leading voices in institutional and evolutionary economics. He was also one of my PhD supervisors and a big influence on how I see the world and the economy. Jeff's interests reach well beyond economics, into history, photography, walking, and even the question of who really wrote Shakespeare's plays. Jeff, you describe yourself as a heterodox economist. Why is that?
Well, thanks, Tanweer and Andrea, for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here. Yes, I'm happy to be described as a heterodox economist, but I must put a little warning here that people can't agree what heterodox means. Often it's taken to mean a particular policy position. I mean, I have policy preferences, but that's not the reason I call myself heterodox. I sometimes agree with the mainstream economists, I sometimes disagree with them. I'm heterodox because I too take a rather radical position on assumptions in economics. In particular, I think models based on utility maximization of limited use. I also think there's big problems with macro models, which are built generally without including money and finance. So I'm quite critical of much what goes on in economics, and also the fact that while mathematics is important, it's not everything. We have to understand the world using other tools. We need understanding of history, of institutions, of philosophy, of sociological ideas that are relevant, and so on. So that's why I'm heterodox.
So from this perspective, and basically from your work on development, what lessons would you apply to the Czech Republic today, as it's facing both a challenge of escaping the middle income trap, with this general feeling and people questioning when are we going to get German salaries, and on the other hand, also the need to join this green transformation?
Yeah, I'm not an expert on the Czech economy, but I visited the country several times and I know a little bit about it. I think that in some ways the growth in Czechoslovakia, while it's not been spectacular, like China's, for example, has been quite creditable since the transformation from communist period. And that's involved developing institutions and developing ways of engaging with markets and trade and employment, which have been relatively successful. But looking forward, I think, yes, you can say that the Czech Republic is middle income, but its problems as middle income are quite different from, say, China. China is slightly lower GDP per capita. It's a bigger economy, but it's lower GDP per capita. And China has much bigger problems, I think, in this middle income range than Czech Republic has. Czech Republic has quite old institutions, some inherited from the Austro-Hungarian period, and has built new institutions in the modern period with the help of the European Union and so on. So I think it's quite set in a way to make progress, but like my country, also facing some difficulties. The problems are as much political as economic, because modern economies do need very careful and expert state guidance, and that means there's a political problem as well. And we have cases of political failure occurring all across Europe. I mean, France is in a political crisis, for example. Germany, to a lesser degree, perhaps, has political problems. Other countries are doing better, but it's a patchwork of different levels of performance. And of course, we have big political problems in the States, which is affecting the world economy. So these problems are in part political, but basically because modern economies need the steerage of government. They need proper regulation, they need strategic guidance, while keeping a large private sector and keeping markets and keeping access to international trade. Those things are required too. And I think the Czech Republic has that problem as well. And it's a question of political change as well as economic change. On the green transformation, obviously, I think we should take that very seriously, because unless we do something to ameliorate or alleviate climate change, we're going to be in serious trouble with both domestic and global dislocations in the system, including huge problems of migration and collapse in some cases because of things like flooding. So that has to be uppermost. And that, again, is a political problem. You need politicians that are committed, not just looking at the short term, but looking more long-term to prosperity and indeed survival of humanity. So I would advise, it's very easy to say and very difficult to do, but I would advise enriched strategic approach to the Czech economy, which takes account the need for investment in industry and also in people in the education system, not just at university level, but also way down to preschool teaching. And so that's the kind of direction I think most countries need to go at the present time.
So linked to this direction or these changes countries have to do, what kind of financial or political institutions should the country develop?
Yeah, it's one of my complaints against the mainstream is that money and finance really are side issues where they shouldn't be. There are big sub-disciplines of money and finance, but they are mainly about generating models and algorithms to deal with what's the best way to invest your money. So you advise corporations and so on. If you look at most macroeconomic models, they don't have money or finance in them. I'm not the first person to raise this criticism. It's very serious. It was raised by a mainstream economist called Frank Hahn 50 years ago. He made this point, and the standard models don't include money. So there really needs to be a really deep intellectual revolution in economics to deal with the fact that we're missing out on this and misunderstanding the importance of finance historically in our economies. I've done some work. I published a book 2 years ago called The Wealth of a Nation. And this book explores the reasons for the British Industrial Revolution in the 18th and 19th centuries. And my argument there is that financial institutions and the growth of financial institutions was absolutely important for that to happen. Yet it's often neglected. A lot of development economists have looked at the importance of finance, but it's not really incorporated into mainstream macroeconomic theory, and it's often neglected in discussions about what needs to be done, like endogenous production functions and so on. They generally do not include finance. So the economists get obsessed with the technicalities rather than looking at the realities. And I think it's very important, for example, for Latin America to look at this issue, as well as for other countries. So financial institutions are absolutely crucial. Economists should integrate them much more into their mainstream thinking and models. In addition, we need to accept that finance is a weird beast. It's not something like ordinary markets. Money is not like potatoes or other commodities. We're subject to the quotes unquote normal laws of supply and demand because money can be spontaneously created by governments and by banks. It's not just a stuff that hangs around and is bought and traded. So it makes money weird. It makes it difficult to model. And for these reasons, because money is unstable, I'm a big fan of Hyman Minsky's work on money, an important post-Keynesian economist. Minsky wrote of the inherent financial instability of finance-driven economies. And he wasn't saying we need to get rid of finance. He was saying that we just have to recognize the nature of the beast that we're trying to analyze. And the results of that, the consequences of that, the policy advice that follows from that, is that we do need careful state regulation of finance and careful rules and ways of thinking about the financial system that take account of the realities. For example, the issue of investment is a big debate in my country, the UK, about this now. Should the government have some fiscal rule which says you can't spend more in a medium term, say, than you have as income, as taxation? A lot of economists, and I agree with them, argue this is a completely wrong way of thinking. Keynes would have said something similar more than half a century ago. The reason why it's wrong is because money is different. Money can be created by a country with control of its currency, with sort of sovereign currency. It's a bit complicated in the Czech Republic with the financial commitments with the Eurozone, but or even though you haven't got the euro. But nevertheless, the truth remains, if there is some financial or monetary autonomy, then there is some scope for government spending more than they get in for some period of time, subject to the proviso that the markets don't crash. If the markets crash, then you're in trouble. But you need to reassure the markets that you have a viable plan for growth. And that plan for growth involves investment in infrastructure, in people, in education, in health services, all these things which are important. And when you've got that plan, it's convincing, then you can stabilize the markets and reassure them that growth will be the result of that plan. You don't have to balance the books, as people say, every minute or every year along the way. So it needs this modern thinking and well-informed economic thinking, which is making some headway, I think, but needs to be recognized more to deal with the financial and monetary problems involved.
We'd like to talk about another very specific type of institution, markets. Your very latest book is called From Marx to Markets. You describe your own intellectual journey from Marxism to the view that markets must play a key role in any vision for the economy. How did you come to that conclusion? And how do your views differ from the position of thinkers like Hayek and Milton Friedman?
That's a great question. Thank you. Yeah, I was fortunate to get that book published. I mean, it's quite difficult to publish your intellectual autobiography. If you got the Nobel Prize, I guess it's easy, but that's some way off at least yet. So I published this book, and this argument which you highlight there about the importance of markets is central to the book, and it's one of the central themes, how my ideas developed on that issue, how I became convinced. Even when I was a sort of moderate Marxist, I began to think about the importance of markets and mixed economies for several reasons. One is the difficulties of planning everything from the center. There's epistemic, knowledge-based difficulties and so on. And secondly, there's things like shocks and changes from outside, which always disturb the best laid plans of mice and men, as people say. So those kind of ideas congealed and developed into quite a strong view supporting what I call a mixed economy. In that, there's a crucial role for markets as pricing mechanisms, not for everything, but for a good number of things, so that they act as baseline price levels, which reflect information about various things going on, innovation, supply, demand, and so on in the economy. There's also a huge role for the state, not just a public sector, which would involve perhaps most or all of education, health, and so on, but also for strategic guidance. As I mentioned earlier, it's very important the state is able to think more long-term than a period of 4 or 5 years for a typical parliament, and able to deal with things like the climate change and the green agenda. Those things are very important and are quite striking. We also have other big problems in the world, not just simply those. And so the state must play a role. So taking that position for most of my intellectual life, I abandoned Marxism. But I'm still a great fan, actually, of Marx and what he achieved intellectually. And my bookshelf has still got lots of Marx on it, and I refer to it very frequently. But I think Marx was wrong on crucial issues. So Marx took one pure position, and that pure position was get rid of markets completely. It says so in the Communist Manifesto, if you don't believe me. We will ban private ownership of property. We will ban buying and selling of commodities, Marx and Engels said in the Communist Manifesto. And they repeated that, and that was the standard view of socialists then and of many still now. So you have this extreme position of wanting ultimately to get rid of all private ownership and all markets. And I can give you names, people are still alive that think that way. On the other hand, you have a market problem. You might call it right-wing, but right-wing is a kind of odd phrase. It means fascism as well, and that's not the same thing. Being pro-market is not necessarily fascistic or right-wing or nationalist. Well, you mentioned Friedman and Hayek. Let's concentrate on them. I think in both those authors are very important economists, have something useful to say. And I think Hayek is quite an inspiring thinker in particular and quite deep in many ways. He's one of the scholars, among others, who highlighted the epistemic or knowledge-based role of markets in garnering, holding and transmitting information, processing information. I think this notion of sets of institutions as information systems is very important, and a lot of people, I think, are putting work into that area now. But with some exceptions, and I'll mention them in a minute, but they generally take this default market position. If it's possible, use a market. If necessary, we'll use the state, but it'll be grudging. It'll be minimal. Now, Hayek is a bit different on that because when pressed on several welfare issues, he came out in favor of a lot of welfare provision, particularly in terms of dealing with poverty and health. But he advised Margaret Thatcher and Pinochet and others about free market policies, which I think are far too unyielding, far too unaccepting of a positive role for the state, or potentially positive role for the state, which is indeed essential for modern economies, for the reasons I've just given. So I worry a lot. I worry still that political assessments of economic issues are often polarized between these two extremes. People that really don't like markets, so they may tolerate them, will say, yeah, okay, I'll have a mixed economy for now, but eventually we're going to have a socialist utopia where there's just common ownership and we can do everything democratically or whatever. It's nonsense. It cannot work. We know that, both from experience and from understanding how these systems work. And at the other end, those people, the default position is markets. And that now has a right-wing variant, a genuine right-wing variant, which we see with Trumpism, which has strong dictatorial, even fascistic overtones to it in terms of concentration of political power, but it has a sort of libertarian streak in terms of markets and letting the rich get richer. The irony is that the result of many years of similar kind of thinking, perhaps in a milder form in the US, is that the US is no longer a free market economy. Is dominated by huge concentrations of corporate power, and that's been well documented. So it ended up with people defending free markets, defending an economy with very, very large corporations. And the Chicago group around Friedman actually abandoned the idea of antitrust laws and so on, and they stimulated this growth, despite what they said about the importance of competition towards oligopolistic power. And when state intervention is necessary to deal with that, and we should restore competition rules and competition policies to their proper place. So I take a very strong intermediate position against these two extremes.
You have also done research on evolutionary economics. Could you please tell us how Darwin's work is relevant to economics?
Yeah, I like that question too. Thank you. My policy transition, I've explained, was more or less around about the late 70s, early 80s, when I shifted away from Marxism, keeping Marxist ideas in some respects, but nevertheless taking the position on a mixed economy. That occurred in the early 80s. And I discovered someone who's very important intellectually for me, and that is Thorstein Veblen, the American economist. And those were the days without the internet, and it was quite difficult to get hold of many of Veblen's writings. If you wanted to read his classic journal articles, you had to go to a library which stocked past issues of the Quarterly Journal of Economics or whatever. So I go to Cambridge Library and look these things up. You couldn't just download them as you can now. So his work was not immediately accessible. Relatively few people in Europe were talking about him. There was a group in the States who organized around the work of Veblen and Commons. But the more I looked at Veblen at this time, this is the early 80s, the more I got fascinated by the guy. And there's odd statements about the importance of Darwin in economics. And initially I was a bit resistant because I was brought up in the sort of standard social science view that biology is dangerous in economics. So we push it away. There's sort of ideas of the badness of social Darwinism and so on. Incidentally, that is a complete myth. It was invented. But I've written on that too. But putting that to the side, why did I get interested in evolution is because Veblen was talking about Darwin and Darwinian ideas and Darwinian selection. And then I came across other economists like Richard Nelson, sadly died quite recently, and I became a personal friend of Dick Nelson, and he was a great help and support for me. But he called himself an evolutionary economist, and I looked at his work and that of the Schumpeter Association, which is called the Internet, which publishes a journal called the Journal of Evolutionary Economics, which has good stuff in it. And I couldn't find anything in there about Veblen, and or indeed about Darwin. In the famous book by Nelson and Winter, Evolutionary Theory of Economic Change, published in 1982, which is a classic book, Darwin is mentioned once in passing. Yeah, if you read the book carefully, there's concepts like selection, like inheritance, like variety. And that's this famous Darwinian triplet of issues. So I asked Dick Nelson personally, I said, why didn't you mention Veblen? Oh no, we're Schumpeterians. Then I read Schumpeter, and Schumpeter had nothing to say about these things at all. So I went on about this for some time and developed my own views and eventually took on board Veblen's ideas completely, I think, in this respect. I mean, he was a pioneer of the proposition that in a more specific evolutionary sense, economies evolve. In other words, they evolve not just in sense of changing. Many people use the word evolution quite reasonably to mean change. It means more than just change, or even just more than qualitative change. It refers, as in Darwin's work, to populations of entities. You have competing individuals, or collaborating individuals, multiple individuals. You have competing or collaborating firms. You have competing or collaborating states. So we live in a world of institutional and individual diversity, and that's what social science deals with. So in some sense, Darwin principles might seem to apply. We have a variety in each case, a variety of individuals, variety of firms, varieties of nation states. We have some kind of selection process. Some firms prosper better than others. Some ride out crises better than others. Some states grow and expand, become rich. Other states decline and disappear. So it's not like lions eating their prey on the savannah, always nature red in tooth and claw, but there is competition and there is change. And so for some time I developed with others ways of thinking about Darwinian principles. And the consummation of this was my book in 2010 called Darwin's Conjecture, which I authored with Geoffrey Hodgson, who's a great colleague on this. And we laid out how you would define, in more general terms, Darwinian principles and apply them to economic and social evolution.
Thank you very much, Geoff.
Thank you.
It's been a great pleasure. Thank you very much.